Resuming debate, the honourable member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the previous Conservative government made the North a priority by launching a comprehensive Northern strategy focused on sovereignty, the environment, the economy, and governance. Our introduction of Bill S6 was just one of the major pieces of legislation we put forward in order to empower the territories in all 4 areas. Despite devolution of resource management to the Yukon in 2003, the federal government remained responsible for environmental regulations in the region under the Yukon Environmental and Socio-economic Assessment Act. Under this Act, 11 of the 14 Yukon First Nations have negotiated individual land claims and self-governing arrangements. After the legislative 5-year review, it was clear that we could improve the legislation for the benefit of the Yukon, introduce legislated time limits for assessment consistent with other federal environmental assessment legislation in order not to stall economic growth with the unnecessary red tape and regulations, provided the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development with the authority to provide binding policy direction to the Yukon Environmental Socio-economic Assessment Board, to equip the Government of Canada to communicate expectations on matters such as board conduct, the use of new technology, and fulfillment of roles and responsibilities related to Aboriginal consultation. Also, allowed for board members' terms to be extended for the purpose of completing a screening or review to both quorum and continuity. Enable the Government of Canada to develop cost recovery regulations so that the costs incurred for public reviews are borne by the proponents of development projects and not the taxpayer, and reduce regulatory burdens by clarifying that a project needs not undergo another assessment when a project authorization is to be renewed or amended unless, in the opinion of the decision body or bodies, there is significant change to the project. When the previous Premier of the Yukon, Darryl Pawlowski, spoke in front of the committee about this bill, he mentioned that this was about evening the playing field. Yukon had a different, less competitive regulatory regime, and that was costing Yukoners desperately needed jobs. The lack of development was also stopping the Yukon from developing its untapped potential and offering jobs to those who need an opportunity. The largest provider of jobs in the Yukon right now is the territorial government. Second is the resource industry, which provides good-paying jobs to Yukoners from across the territory. Thousands of these employees are Indigenous people. The Trudeau Liberals talk a big game when it comes to supporting Canada's Indigenous people, but how does the government expect to provide economic opportunity for these communities to grow when they continually put up barriers instead of opening up opportunities like they promised? For example, mining in particular is the key to wealth for many First Nation groups. Whether it's gold, copper, or some other mineral, mining doesn't happen unless a company can negotiate an agreement with First Nations who have treaty rights to the land. Bill C-17 is just another example of the difference between the previous Conservative government that empowered Northerners and the current Liberal government, which is obsessed with taking power away from the territories and bringing in countless regulations to stifle economic opportunity and growth. Bill C-17 is a step back in the progress that has been made for resource development in the Yukon. It seeks to expand governmental regulations and stifle growth. These unnecessary regulations will impede private sector investment and pose further threats to the jobs and the economic development in the region. The initial goal of the Yukon Environmental Socio-economic Assessment Act was to establish a single development assessment process for projects on all federal, territorial, and First Nations land in the Yukon. We did that and improved upon it. The Liberal government seems intent on doing all the good work we did. C-17 flies in the face of economic development and diversification by generating more government red tape and extra regulations that deter private investment. In a time of global economic uncertainty, the Liberal government continues to increase deficits and give money to everyone who has their hands out, rather than eliminating barriers to investment to improve the economy. Bill C-17 puts the people of the Yukon at a competitive disadvantage with the rest of Canada for private investment. As industry is dissuaded from resource exploration in the region by an uncertain review process and a seemingly endless amount of bureaucratic reassessment. This unlimited environmental review process and perpetual reassessment calls into question the Liberals' plan for a larger pan-Canadian environmental process review. Do the Liberals want to remove timelines in the rest of Canada too? Did they even consider regulatory consistency across the country when writing this bill? At a time when the government should be focusing on stabilizing the economy, the Liberals continue to dole out money in their sunny ways delirium and feverishly build barriers to private investment in Canada, particularly in our northern regions. Mr. Speaker, let's look at some of those barriers. The carbon tax. A carbon tax is a tax on everything. The Trudeau government does not seem to understand that the northern economy relies...
Order. Order. Just a brief reminder to the honourable member. I didn't stop him at the first instance of that, but he'll recall that we don't use the names of other honourable members in the House. We can refer to them by their title or by their riding name, but not using the name of the individuals or members in the House in that manner. The honourable member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you. Okay, the territories have already become a leader in a climate change adaptation because of the frontline impact they have already had to experience. It is the responsibility to now ask them to do more when our northern communities are facing many economic and environmental challenges. According to the Mining Association of Canada, a typical Canadian mine spends about 30% of its annual budget on energy, and that the impact of the federal carbon price will hit northern mines the hardest. For these northern mines, their sole source of power is from fossil fuels. And let us not forget the thousands of pounds of resources that must be flown in order to just start operations on these mines. Mr. Speaker, with the election of Donald Trump south of the border, this means that the mining operations in places like Alaska and Montana will not be paying an uncompetitive carbon tax, but instead driving from a lower tax agenda. How can we expect to help the economy if we bring an uncompetitive carbon tax that simply encourages mining companies to take investment and jobs outside of Canada? I should note that we have some of the strictest environmental regulations in the world. Let's talk about the oil and gas moratorium. Just a number of weeks ago, the Premier of the Northwest Territories, Bob McLeod, told the Arctic Oil and Gas Symposium that the 5-year ban on Arctic drilling in the Beaufort Sea has created a no-win situation for his territory's plans to develop a strong resource economy. The same has happened all across the Canadian North. For years, our northern territories have negotiated in good faith to have the power to make their own decisions when it comes to their natural resources, and the Prime Minister has failed on his promise to be a partner of our northern communities. Instead, he has forced an agreement upon them that will leave hundreds of billions of dollars of oil and gas in the ground and thousands of potential good-paying jobs off the table. The mining industry is at the heart of the economic opportunity for many residents in the north. The majority of projects requests that will be tied up, slowed down, and ultimately ruined by this legislation, and will impact investment in this industry. The suggestion that such a policy will benefit the Yukon reveals just how out of touch the Liberals are from our northern communities. C-17 is taking away northern independence. The Liberal promise to simply repeal the controversial sections of Bill S6 is another example of how they made promises without any consideration for the consequences. There could have been an opportunity to find a solution that addressed everyone's concerns while still supporting economic development in the Yukon. But instead, the Liberals are using a blunt instrument of repeal. The people of the Yukon have the right to determine their own policies on natural resource development rather than having the federal government restrict their opportunities for economic development. The Liberal government is shutting out the potential for many jobs in the natural resource sector that could be created from diverse private investment in the Yukon and all of Canada's northern regions. Bill C-17 introduces uncertainty into the resource development review process that will undermine economic opportunities for all Yukoners as well as create uncertainty for the rest of Canada about whether this will form the basis of the Liberal approach in the future. C-17 is detrimental to the independence of our northern communities, as it takes the devolution of regulatory power away from the territorial government, as was introduced by S6, and returns it to the hands of the federal minister. The Liberal minister from Toronto cannot know the realities on this ground like the people who live it every day. The power of Yukoners to decide what is best for their economy is being taken away and dictated by Ottawa. Canada is a country rich in natural resources, and these resources can be greatly contribute to the country's economy and the economy of the Yukon, increasing opportunities for all Canadians. Such avenues for development should especially be pursued in the current economic climate, but the Liberals would rather create additional levels of bureaucracy and an uncertain future to the detriment of all Canadians. Now we have uncertainty in the review process. By introducing a limitless environmental review process and mandating continued project reassessment, the Liberals are sending a clear message that they will not support resource development in Canada's north. The removal of time limits and the option for exempting renewals, on the other hand, fits well with the ongoing narrative that the Liberals are introducing unnecessary delays and uncertainty into our regulatory process. Additionally, we can make the point that this change puts the Yukon at a competitive disadvantage with the rest of Canada for attracting private investment. Private companies will take their investments elsewhere, and people of the Yukon will not be able to experience the benefits of an expanding economy. While the Liberals continue their spending spree and ignoring the ballooning deficit, this problem will only be increased as the Liberals create increasing uncertainty throughout the country with regards to review process, sending a clear message to the industry that Canada is not interested in pursuing natural development. This will have an impact on the economy. The economy in the north is suffering enough as it is. We do not need the Liberals chasing away investment. Jobs are getting harder to come by in the north, and instead of encouraging investment in resource development and creating more jobs, the Liberals are developing a larger bureaucracy and eliminating opportunity. The Trudeau government is so caught up in their own concerns for expanding the environmental bureaucracy that they have forgotten the people of the Yukon who are struggling just to make ends meet because of a bad economy. The Liberals are stacking the deck against hardworking Canadians who are trying to provide for their families. Mr. Speaker, according to Statistics Canada annual estimates of mineral productions, Yukon Territory has seen a decline of the dollar amount from mining activities for all but one of the past 6 years. Since 2012, the amount of money brought into the territories from mining production has decreased by a staggering 25%. By increasing the barriers of entry, by putting not a firm end date on environmental assessment, and through increasing operation costs with their carbon tax grab scheme, it is clear that the Liberals do not care about the economic future of the Yukon. If the decline in the actual value of minerals do not raise alarms about the negative impacts of these policies, a more staggering fact is the extreme decline in new investment. Since the Liberals took power just 2 years ago, StatsCan reported that the actual investment in the mining in the Yukon has decreased by over 42%, or equivalent of $90 million. Bill C-17 is also an example of the Liberals thinking they know best for the territories. The people of the Yukon should be the ones to decide whether extra environmental regulations are necessary, as it is their economy that is being affected. In the Yukon, one of the biggest problems is the fact that so many residents rely on the government to provide employment instead of a strong private sector. The fact that the Liberals are putting up so many barriers for private sector investment, private sector job creation, with a bill like C-17 seems like a personal attack on those trying to find jobs in the Yukon. This bill, along with the carbon tax scheme that the Liberals are forcing onto the provinces and territories, look as if the government has a vendetta against any economic growth in the north. Mr. Speaker, I went to the Yukon to meet with stakeholders about this bill. They weren't impressed. One of the reasons they weren't impressed is because the Yukon mining industry is struggling to survive. Although mining has always represented a huge share of the Yukon's economy in the recent years, there has been a steep decline in the amount of open mines. This has taken millions out of the economy and thousands of jobs. As of today, there is only one mine open and producing in the Yukon, the Minto Copper Mine. I visited the mine with my colleague, MP for Lakeland, to get a tour of the operation and was told that their operation is heavily dependent on the price of copper. With such low prices, the future is always uncertain. Adding more red tape to a struggling operation is not going to help anyone. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, the Conservative Party's vision has been to streamline and harmonize regulatory regimes across Canada in order to promote investment confidence, provide consistency and transparency, and increasing efficiency in regulatory regimes. The economy of the Yukon and all of the North needs more development and investments, and it needs to be put back in the hands of the people who understand it best. To think otherwise would be ignorant. Canada cannot continue on this uncertain path of unnecessary bureaucratic red tape that only serves to turn away private investment and cut jobs. The North, so rich in natural resources and human resources, has the potential to be a powerhouse of the industry in this country. But the Liberals want to keep resources in the ground and deny economic opportunity to millions of Canadians. Bill C-17 is a knife in the heart of the northern economy and just one example of how the Liberals are taking away any provincial self-determination, creating uncertainty in regulations and continually desecrating Canada's economic well-being. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the member of Red Deer Mountain View, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word "that" and substituting the following. Bill C-17, an act to amend the Yukon Environmental and Socio-economic Assessment Act and to make consequential amendments to another act, be now read a second time, but that order be discharged, the bill withdrawn, and the subject matter thereof referred to the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Yurdiga, seconded by Mr. Dreeshen, moves that the motion be amended by deleting all of the words after the word "that" and substituting the following. That Bill C-17, an act to amend the Yukon Environmental and Socio-economic Assessment Act and to make consequential amendment to another act, be not now read a second time, but that the order be discharged, the bill withdrawn, and the subject matter thereof referred to the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. The motion for the amendment is admissible. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Yukon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to try and quickly make a few points as to how the comments on how the number of things the member said in his speech are either incorrect or actually do not support his amendment. First of all, a number of times he importantly said that the people of the Yukon should decide, and that's exactly what this bill is about. When the previous government imposed 4 major conditions without consulting the people of the Yukon, without allowing them to negotiate, the economic development people in the Yukon, the First Nations, there was 2 huge gatherings of the public in contravention so they could make their own decisions, and that's what this bill is all about. I'm glad he talked about Northern Strategy because the government's right in the process of developing one from the bottom up, an Arctic policy framework, working with leaders in the North. He mentioned a few things that were agreed to in the bill. There were 72 things agreed to. So some of those things he mentioned as problems are not problems because they're already agreed to, and we're not touching those. He made an assessment that about reassessments. Through some of those changes, there's been changes to the regulations that now allow that in certain conditions, on the appropriate conditions, reassessments won't have to be done. He talked about mining is at the heart of the northern economic development, and there's barriers. And that's exactly another very important point, because what this bill does is it removes the uncertainty, it takes away the barriers. Investment is down, he talked about, and that's exactly why we want to change this. So investment goes up, although he also made a good point, it's partly because of world metal prices. And finally, related to mining, he talked about mining. I don't have time to read them all, but I have later on, somewhere else in the debate, I have 2 letters from Mines and a letter from the Chamber of Mines that says the Government of Yukon, Self-Governing First Nations, Council of Yukon First Nations, and the Yukon Chamber of Mines look forward to see Bill C-17 passed without change as soon as possible. So all his references to mining wanted to go ahead. This is exactly what mining wants, is C-17 passed.
Member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, there's a real big challenge out there when it comes to investment in our resource industry. As we add more regulations, more red tape, there's a challenge. You know, when industry wants to invest, they're looking at a lot of things. They're looking at the tax load, whether it's federal, whether it's a territorial. That's a big, huge factor. Now, adding on a carbon tax, and we have uncertainty about the reassessment and taking out time limits. That's pushing it to the edge where investment is not worth it. I mean, how long will it take? Will the environmental review, would it be 1 year, 5 years? We don't know. And that's why timelines are important. It instills confidence within the industry. There's confidence that, yes, it's going to take this long to do. We're going to invest this amount of dollars for the assessment. But now we're looking at, after that, say they do get approval and they start their operation. And now there's a challenge now. What will the reassessment look like? We just invested, for example, we've invested $100 million in this operation, and now a reassessment comes up. And what if they don't meet the targets that was put out before them? They lost their investment because the reassessment says no, because of climate change or whatever reason it may be. Now, there's that huge factor that maybe won't be operational in 5 years because of the reassessment. You know, it's just really sad. If there's no changes to the operation, I don't believe it's helpful to do a reassessment again on an operation that is exactly the same. And now with the C-17, the possibility of reassessment after reassessment will be a negative impact for people who want to invest in the resource industry in the north. Thank you, Mr.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Abitibi, Beijing, Nunavik, AU.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake for his speech. I'm kind of intrigued by the presentation in a way that, you know, Mr. Speaker, I come from a region where there is an environmental assessment and review process that's pretty complex under the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. A lot of people have argued in the past that this process is an impediment to development in the territory. Well, Mr. Speaker, after 40 years with that process in place, if there's one place in this country where development is going well, it's in the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement area. And I think that is the objective of any environmental assessment process, Mr. Speaker. I think that when developers arrive in a territory and they know the rules of the game, they know the rules under legislation and environmental assessment, that's what helps development in any given territory. And that is what forges partnerships with Indigenous peoples. I want my friend to comment on this.
The honourable member for Fort McMurray, Cold Lake.
Well, I thank you for the member's question. You know, as a former businessman, I always look for certainty. If I was going to invest somewhere, I always looked at where is the best place to invest. What are the risks? And rules are very important. I mean, look at for example, the Liberals like to have time allocations to limited bait. But when it comes to the Yukon YESAB board, they want to remove all limits. So they're not really following their own advice. I mean, if they want to take away time limits, we should be able to speak as long as we want. You know, we've got to lead by example. And rules are very important, and knowing, and I agree, you have to know what the rules are. But what I'm fearful of is that will not create investment in the North. Not knowing how long the assessment process is going to take, when I'm going to have a reassessment. So these things are factors. If we can eliminate that, I think we'll have more investment in the North. And we do need investment in the North because, you know, when I was up there visiting, the Yukon with my colleague, there's a lot of unemployment. You know, the best social program is a job. And we need to get jobs to the Yukon and the North. Jobs creation is #1 priority in my mind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Red Deer Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and certainly my honourable friend from Fort McMurray Cold Lake understands the types of concerns that we have when you have an investment climate that is unsure and regulations that are certainly putting lots of jobs and investment in jeopardy. And I did have the opportunity a number of years ago to be on Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development and be in the territories when we talked about certain barriers that there were to investment. And again, the key thing is certainty, and that was a critical part. I just asked the minister a short time ago about the 4 sections of the Act once they're appealed, what is going to happen to the reassessment and the timelines if these things are ahead of the board for consideration. And if I understood her question, it was go back to square one. This is where it's going to be. So I'm just wondering, perhaps, if the member can just talk a little bit about just how many more hits that he feels that Western Canada and the North can take from this Liberal government.
The honourable member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. You know, when we're looking at the impact of the economy, as we look at, say, for example, in my riding, Fort McMurray, with the provincial government putting all these new regulations in place and in creating bureaucracy, over-managing the resource industry, we have seen investment leave Alberta in droves. We look at Saskatchewan. We see them going to Saskatchewan and other jurisdictions in our Canada and outside our Canada, because regulations, uncertainty in the market will cause industry to move. And like I said earlier, we're at a point now that industry, the resource industry, is going to look at it twice as the risks are too high. What's next? Regulation after regulation, delay after delay. This is going to hurt our economy. I mean, Alberta is suffering immensely because of the provincial new regulations, the carbon tax. These adds all up, and we're going to see less investment in these regions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.